Hi, and welcome back to our next module. Last module, we looked at Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, where he said that happiness is the ultimate end that we should be working towards, and that virtue, living a virtuous life, which is the means between excess and deficit, is the way to get there. This week, we're going to look at Thomas Aquinas, Middle Ages philosopher and Catholic theologian, Dominican and priest, who really took Aristotle and brought him to the Western world. And we're going to see that Aquinas' approach to ethics really built upon Aristotle and helped us to understand certain concepts in regards to ethics like law that we might know today. So a little bit about Thomas first. So Thomas was born in modern-day Italy in about 1225, and he really lived his whole life studying under Benedictine monks for a good portion of his early life. The reason being is because monasteries at that time were really the centers of education. When we think of colleges or the modern education system, it really began through the Catholic Church in Europe. And we see this later on in the University of Naples and in the University of Paris, which is believed to be the first university in Europe where Thomas first studied and then taught at. After joining the Dominicans, their formal name is the Order of Preachers, but they're given the name Dominicans after Saint Dominic, who founded them. He dedicated himself really to study and to pursuing God through the study of faith and reason. At that time, philosophy wasn't really seen as a subject matter that could mesh with faith, which is hard to believe because much of theology, thanks to Thomas Aquinas, is influenced by philosophy. At the time, the church was really influenced by Plato, but didn't really see Aristotle as important. Aquinas really became a student, so to speak, of Aristotle's thought and brought Aristotle and also really popularizing the Socratic method into the Western world at the time. And by that means changed theology forever and is one of the more influential individuals in Western philosophy after the Greek philosophers of Plato, Socrates, and Aristotle. So very big deal. And we're going to revisit him a couple of times throughout this course just because his work is so far-reaching into a lot of branches of philosophy. But for this module, we're going to focus on what he wrote in regards to ethics. He wrote various different works, but his most famous work by far is called Summa Theologica, which is Latin for the Summary of Theology. And you're going to see when you read parts of it that he really used the Socratic method. It's a method we should adopt today and when we have public discourse, where instead of just arguing, Thomas first outlines the objections to his point or the common objections to a point. Then he says what his point is, and then he responds to each objection in turn. Kind of how Socrates would make a point, a hypothesis, throw a scenario for where it could or could not exist, and through that dialogue of back and forth, reach a new conclusion. Aquinas kind of does a similar thing by directly responding to objections. So you can see how the Socratic method affects his writing, and you're going to see his writing written out in that fashion very succinctly. Objection, his reply, and the response to each objection. He was later canonized a Catholic saint, so he is Saint Thomas Aquinas in the Roman Catholic Church in 1323. So very influential figure, not only in Catholic theology, but in Western philosophy in general. Aquinas begins with this thought of what is man's last end, talking about what is the ultimate purpose. When we talk about the last end, what is the ultimate purpose for human existence? Because in Aquinas' mind, every human action, everything we do must be for a greater end. An action doesn't exist in and of itself. So what's an example of that? If I eat, I don't hopefully necessarily just eat for the sake of eating. I eat because I'm hungry, or I eat for pleasure, or I eat to be satisfied, right? In a similar way, I might do a nice thing for someone to make them happy, or to bring happiness to myself, or to win praise from other people. In every instance, everything we do has an ultimate reason or purpose as to why we do it, right? We might study in order to get a good grade, or we might study so that people might think we're a studious or smart person. In other words, we're always having an ultimate reason or purpose for everything that we do. According to Aquinas, the ultimate purpose or end, to use his language, to which something tends to is called its telos. So a telos is the ultimate end for which something that we do is oriented to, is aimed at. And Aquinas says that humanity's ultimate end, our purpose for why we exist, is God, the divine. And that really it is to know and love God. So for Aquinas, why do we exist as humans? Why do we do anything? We exist to know and to love God, who is beyond our understanding, and is the ultimate end, what we're ultimately oriented to as human persons. It's a big statement because that means our ultimate sense of happiness. So we think back to Aristotle, you can start to see how Aquinas is very much influenced by Aristotle, how everything that we seek in terms of happiness, that this ultimate end of happiness will only be attained in God. So we start to see in this branch of ethics and philosophy, when we try to answer the question of what do we ought to do, who do we ought to be, we're starting to see this trend in ethics that, well, it's to be happy, if we're to follow Aristotle's train of thought. For Aquinas, well, how do we be happy? What ought we to do and ought we to be happy? Well, for Aquinas, we must know and love God in order to be happy. Apart from truly knowing and loving God, perfect happiness is ultimately not possible. And while we might tend towards that, in other words, while we might through our lives aim towards being happy and knowing and loving God, just because we're aiming for it doesn't mean that we've gotten there. Ultimately, while we can experience parts of perfect happiness here on earth, usually more often than not through imperfect happiness and incomplete happiness, but we in slivers can attain or taste, that might be a better way to put it, perfect happiness. For Aquinas, we will only ever attain full perfect happiness in heaven, when we see God face to face, what he refers to as the beatific vision, this blessed vision where we see God face to face in heaven. It is only in heaven where humanity actually reaches its end. So to put it bluntly, we will not experience our ultimate purpose until we reach heaven. But we should orient our lives in such a way that we are working towards heaven by knowing and loving God. That is what Aquinas would say is the purpose of human existence. So this leads us to understand his sense of anthropology, anthropology being the study of humanity, human behavior. And Aquinas understands the human person to be dual, in the sense that we are body and spirit, or body and intellective soul. This is very important because if the ultimate end is to reach perfect happiness, and perfect happiness is attained in heaven, but it is in the way we live this life that we aim towards it and we get there, then the way that we live this life is through our body and our soul. So you start seeing the purpose of ethics. What do we ought to do? What do we ought to be to reach happiness? Well, for Aquinas, it's going to be very much how do you live your life by fully working together between your body and your soul. So the body and soul is going to be very important. He raises a lot of points about explaining how you need both the body and soul, in part because there were ancient thoughts and theories in the centuries prior to him that would either glorify the human body, and would just focus on the physical world, or other thoughts such as the Gnostics that would just focus on the spiritual world and say that the body in the material world is bad and we need to free our souls from the material world. Aquinas, building on other theologians and philosophers such as Augustine, who we'll see later on, really talks about how, no, the body is not bad and the soul is good. We need both the body and the soul. A human person is not just a body, and a human person is not just a soul. The human person is body and soul. The reason for that is while the soul, remember back to the tripartite soul, which we'll talk about in a second, from Socrates and Plato, the intellect, the desire, the reason, he really equates the soul with human reason, and that actions derive from our reason, what we might know more commonly as the concept of free will, that we have the ability based on reason to make decisions, to make choices, and these choices are translated into actions. That all that process of making choices based on reason, Aquinas attributes to the soul. But actions need to be done. A soul can't do an action. That requires the physical world, because actions are done within the physical world. It requires interaction with people, with things, with the world around us. So that's where the body comes in. So in order for us to act as humans, and in so as in through acting, we are getting closer to our ultimate end of happiness, we need the body. We need this to interact with the world. So decisions begin with the free will and the reason, and are lived out through our body in the physical world. And so the human person, through reason and through the body, are making decisions and actions that are hopefully aimed towards our end of happiness. And it is through living as body and spirit that we attain our ultimate end in happiness. That is what Aquinas would say would be our ultimate purpose, and that is how he would view the human person. We are made of body and soul. We need both. So in that regard, the body to Aquinas is the corporal, a physical substance that's part of what makes up each person. Not all bodies or things have souls. Not all things are living. So remember, this is unique to his view of living things, and in particular human, in its regard to an intellective soul. The body enables a human being to be in the world and its physical aspects of a person, and therefore it is the part that can interact with the physical world. So again, the body is what allows us to create the actions that lead us to our end of happiness. The body is not sufficient in itself in that it can't do anything apart from the soul, because the soul is the reason behind our actions. So the soul, or the spirit, is the non-physical aspect of a person that gives it life. So building off Plato, so you can see how Aquinas is very much influenced by Plato, Socrates, and Aristotle. He very much takes his idea of the soul, the spirit, from Plato's tripartite soul. The intellect, desire, emotion. That this life force within us, Aquinas would call the soul, or the spirit. And it's our animating principle. He would differentiate the soul within three ways. First is the vegetative soul. This is common to all living things, so you might think of plants in being in a vegetative state, so to speak. It is what their life force. However, it is not the same as a soul, as if there was like when we think of spirit, we think of like little beings almost, or ghosts that live within an animal. No, Aquinas was not a believer in pantheism, the belief that, all living things that might have different souls or deities within them. That's not what Aquinas is saying at all. What he's simply referring to is the fact that it is a living being. It has it is animated. It is alive. It's not a pencil. It's not a book. A plant can grow. So it's a very, very basic understanding of being alive. The sensitive soul refers to animals beyond plants. So in this regard, animals can touch, see, hear, taste, smell. They might even have memory or imagination. If you've ever seen your dog dream and kind of move. But it's not the same kind of reason or intellect that human beings have. To this regard, the highest level or understanding of the soul is what Aquinas refers to as the intellective soul. This is specific to human beings and what sets human beings apart from any other living creature or living thing in this world. Aquinas, drawing from his religious background as a Catholic priest and monk, is going to refer to how humans are made in the image and likeness of God. Nothing else is made in the image and likeness of God. Not animals, not plants, not anything else in the world. They might reflect God, God's beauty, goodness, and truth. And we're going to talk about this a second about the natural law and tell us something about God's goodness. But they do not reflect the image and likeness of God like humans do. So when he refers to the soul and as far as humans, it's a very more profound thing than any other living being. But that being said, the simple fact of things are alive, this is what he's going to attribute to the spirit in terms of the spiritual world, and the physical world, that which we can touch, see, and hear. The human soul is an intellective soul that contains within itself the properties of both the sensitive and the vegetative soul, so of the lower kind of classifications of soul. And it is only because of the spirit that humans can act and have free will. So again, let's think. Our ultimate end as human beings is perfect happiness, which is to know and love God, which will only be attained in heaven. But the way that we get there is through the decisions and actions that we make in this life. Those decisions are based in human reason, which comes from our spirit, our soul, our free will to choose. But it's lived out, acted in the physical world through our bodies. So by using our souls with our bodies, we make decisions and actions that are hopefully aims toward our ends of happiness, hopefully help us to love and know God. And by living that, we can attain our ultimate end of happiness in the next life. Well, what governs our actions? So remember, ethics refers to what we ought to be and do to attain happiness. Well, we know how that works. That was the whole first part of this presentation. The way it works is by using our reason, our soul, and living out those decisions through our bodies in the physical world to attain happiness. But remember the key phrase, what do we ought to do? Not just what we have to do, what do we ought to do? That means there are things that we should do and things that we shouldn't do. How do we regulate that? That is kind of where ethics, the rubber of ethics meets the road, so to speak, where ethics becomes real is by defining what should and shouldn't we do, and let's make it into law. That is the purpose of law, a rule, a measure of our actions. So not just saying that we can act, but measuring, regulating our actions by which human action is restrained or human action is encouraged, induced. So therefore, a law pertains to our reason, since reason is what regulates human action. Remember, our reason dictates our action. So law is based on reason. So good laws should be reasonable. And law is chiefly chiefly ordered to uphold the common good. That which aids all of us to work towards attaining happiness. That might be a way of understanding the common good. What is the collective good that all humanity should be able to experience, so that way we all have the opportunity to be able to work towards happiness? When that opportunity to work attain towards happiness is taken away from us, we might say that that's an infringement on the common good. So laws, therefore, they regulate our action, but they're supposed to be reasonable because they're based on reason, since reason dictates action. And their ultimate purpose, a good law's ultimate purpose, is to uphold the common good. All of our ability and opportunity to actually be able to seek and obtain happiness. And so when we think of, say, civil laws, which are based on human law, which we'll see in a second, we think that, well, a good law in our society, not only tells us what we should and shouldn't do, it should be reasonable, and it should help a group of people, our society, be able to attain towards happiness. So in other words, laws are telling us how to be ethical, how to live ethics. However, according to Aquinas, because our ultimate end is God, all law is rooted in or comes from eternal law. So eternal law is an umbrella term of the law stemming from God's governance of reality. So for Aquinas and for Catholic theology, all of existence comes from God, because God is the source of all of existence. God is who put all of existence into motion, into being, who orders all of creation. And so the orderliness of creation you can think of as laws. This manifests itself in very basic things that you've learned, probably like laws of physics. You can see that the existence is orderly. There's reason. For example, winter will never come before fall. There's always goes winter, summer, falls, winter, spring, summer, fall. Excuse me. So for Aquinas, and he'll point this out in his proof for the existence of God, that things are contingent on other things, that there's a natural orderliness to existence. We can interpret this orderliness as to say there are laws that govern reality and existence. These overarching laws that hold existence together and that dictate human existence, Aquinas would refer to as eternal law, that which God has put into place to govern reality. God is not restricted by these laws, since God is kind of above everything. God is Alpha and Omega, beginning and the end. Because this, God is also omnipresent and omnipotent. He is not restricted by space, location. He is all-powerful. So because he is not confined by space and location, these laws are not confined to space and location. Therefore, eternal law applies to all people and all places everywhere. It trumps all other law, so to speak. And any good, reasonable law is going to come from eternal law because, again, for Aquinas, our ultimate end is happiness. Happiness can only be attained in God. And so any law that governs our action should be rooted in God. So everything flows from God, from eternal law. There are two types of subsets of law within eternal law. So eternal law can be understood under two subcategories: natural law and divine law. Divine law will ultimately, in the Judeo-Christian tradition, be revealed through the sacred scriptures and through traditions. The natural law, though, any individual can come to understand through reason. So in this regard, natural law is a rational creature. So we think of humans' ability to think, to have free will. It comes from our participation in eternal law. So because we exist, basically, in this universe that God created and governs with eternal law, because we have reason and are made in God's image and likeness, can come to see something of eternal law around us just by thinking, just by observing the world. This ability to tap into God's laws throughout the universe is what Aquinas refers to as natural law. So someone doesn't need to believe God exists or know of God in order to tap into natural law. Simply, you just need to have the ability to reason. You need to have a soul. We can discern natural law through our natural reason encountering the world around us. It is the function of natural law to discern good and evil. Classic example: someone may not be religious, but be able to tell, I should do that or I shouldn't do that. People who may not necessarily believe in God's existence, if they're reasonable individuals, would say that if I want to accomplish a certain goal, there are things I should do and things that I should avoid. In other words, if I want to do well on the sports field, I would probably be better suited to practice. Or if I wanted to do well on a test, it would probably be a good idea to study. Now, people might have natural ability that might curtail their need to practice or study as much as someone else. We get the principle. It's a good idea to do certain things. It would be a bad idea not to study if you want to do well on a test, or not to practice if you want to do well in the sports field. It's pretty basic when you think of it, that if we're honest with ourselves, there is good and evil in the world. There is right and wrong. A lot of times we can get caught up with the concept of subjective truth. In other words, you might hear it in the phrase of, well, that's someone's opinion. You can't say someone's opinion is wrong. Well, part of it is, think of opinions less as that, but as perspectives. We all have perspectives on truth. Remember the cave, right? It's not about denying that there are perspectives, but rather how can we build perspectives on one another to journey towards truth out of the cave, to the forms, to our ultimate ends, which Plato would name the forms, Aristotle would name happiness, and Aquinas would name happiness, but would name specifically as God. So when we simply just say, oh, well, that's an opinion, what we're kind of saying is we don't want to move past perspective to attaining truth. And so we kind of just sit there. But I would ask you, the next time that you think, well, that's just someone's opinion, think of what it is and really think, is there something deeper with what they're trying to say? Is there something really true with what they're trying to say? In other words, if I were to say it's okay to hurt, someone else, the relativistic response could be, well, that's your opinion. But if you would really think with your reason and your mind, regardless if not you're religious, you'd be like, well, there's something off, something that just doesn't seem right about hurting another person. It just doesn't seem right to do that. It doesn't seem like that would lead me to who I should try to be and to be a happy person. Happy people don't hurt other people. When you make that conclusion, Aquinas would be saying that you're tapping into the natural law. You're not doing it because God told you to do it. In a way you are, because it's tapping into eternal law, but you're not realizing it. Rather, what he's saying is you're recognizing the natural rights and wrongs in the world that are built into the universe. And you're recognizing that there is ultimately objective truth, things you should do and things you shouldn't do. As a result, human law or civil law, according to Aquinas, ought to be born from the principles of nature. So in other words, as a human being, we recognize that if I'm going to ultimately be happy, that means I should probably not hurt people or hurt myself. Therefore, it would make sense to have a civil law that makes it illegal to hurt other people. Make sense? In that regard, a civil law that says don't hurt other people is reasonable because it's based in natural law, which is ultimately based in eternal law. That would be how Aquinas would approach a hierarchy of law. Why does any of this matter? Because it only matters if we truly believe that our ultimate purpose is happiness. If we have no sense of our ultimate purpose and what we should be striving for, laws can be very subjective. It doesn't really matter what you should and shouldn't do because it's not clear what you should be trying to get to. It wouldn't make much sense if I told you that you should practice soccer if your goal is to be a violinist, because practicing soccer is probably not going to help you be a very good violinist. So I could talk to you about all the laws that govern soccer, and it's going to sound ridiculous to you because it has nothing to do with becoming good at practicing violin. In a similar way, any kind of law or conversation on law, natural law, human law, eternal law, only makes sense if we know where we're trying to go, if we know what our ultimate purpose is, and if we know that we agree that that purpose is ultimate happiness. And in as much as Aquinas talks about eternal law, that we believe that that ultimate happiness is ultimately found in God. If we believe that, and we see that to be true, which Aquinas would say it is true, then this makes sense. Then it makes sense, well, if I want to attain happiness and happiness in God, there's a right way to get there, and there are things that are going to keep me from getting there. So law is about helping us get rid of those things that would keep us from getting there and help us to focus on the things that will help us get there. In this way, and this is where Aquinas builds off Aristotle again, he talks how actions need to be centered on virtue, and that all acts of virtue are prescribed by natural law. So that medium between being a deficient in virtue and an excess of virtue is really what God has ordained us to be. He has ordained us or called us to live in that rightly ordered action between excess and deficit, which Aristotle called virtue. So for Aquinas, he's going to say that we need to in order to live laws rightly, we need to be virtuous individuals. So in addition to natural law, the other subset of eternal law is divine law. So divine law is the law explicitly revealed by God in addition to natural or human law. So human law derives from natural law. God sometimes reveals divine law because of the insufficiency of human judgment. So as we just described in the last slide, while we are rational beings and can perceive right and wrong in the world, we may not always agree, or we may get caught up in our perspectives and not able to build on perspectives to get out of the cave, so to speak, to use Plato's language. So God kind of has to communicate directly or insert God's self into the physical world to tell us exactly what we ought to do and not ought to do in order to attain happiness. This is, in the Judeo-Christian tradition, what we would call divine revelation. So you see Aquinas very much building on his situatedness of being religious, of seeing that God is real and that everything is built around God, and that God's revelation has weight. And so when God reveals himself only to not all people, but certain people throughout time. So you think of the Judeo-Christian tradition of God revealing himself to prophets, and then God becoming one of us in Jesus, and then speaking to the apostles. That would be an example of how divine law is revealed to certain people in certain times and places. And just like human law judges external actions, divine law looks at our internal actions, our internal desires and motivators. And while divine law can add to natural law, it takes precedence over natural and human law, because divine law is kind of a direct path to eternal law. It is God specifically speaking to us. So think of it this way. Eternal law is God's law that governs existence. Natural law is the way that we can understand those laws just through reason, just through looking at the world and noticing the patterns and the orderliness and rightly deducing that there are certain things we should and should not do. Divine law is God kind of breaking through the visible world, the physical world, and directly communicating with us the eternal law. So natural law is us kind of coming to understand through our own minds eternal law just by looking at the world. Divine law is God directly communicating to us what the eternal law is, or the pieces of eternal law he thinks we need to know in order to live a rightly just life to attain happiness. So all in all, a quick summary then of Aquinas in his Ethics is this. Our ultimate purpose is happiness. Happiness is to know and to love God. We will ultimately attain this perfect happiness in heaven when we see God face to face. We can work towards that happiness here on earth. We work towards that happiness by using our soul and our reason to make decisions that are rational, that are lived out through our bodies in the physical world and our actions. But to ensure that our actions are virtuous and that our actions actually lead towards happiness, we have law to govern our actions, to quite literally tell us what we ought to do and ought not to do to attain that happiness. And so in that way, laws are a very physical and real embodiment of ethics. But laws, to be good laws, have to be ruled in eternal law, God's law that governs existence, because our ultimate purpose is God. And while we can come to understand eternal law through our reason in nature, the natural law, we can also come to understand eternal law through what God has directly communicated to us in divine law. And so by understanding law in relationship to God himself, and by acting upon what God has revealed to us through our reason, then we can live a virtuous life and strive to live a happy life, which is our ultimate purpose that we'll attain ultimately in God. And for that would be Aquinas' ethics.